In our last video, we looked at the first part of speciation, right? Looking at pre- and post-zygotic barriers, right? Things that prevent the creation of a zygote, and also then the things that can prevent zygotes from, or not really zygotes, but organisms from mating post-zygotically after they've been born and raised up. And those can be basically one of two types of things. They can be some sort of physical barrier that prevents mating, but then they can also be some other barrier that prevents mating, right? Like time barrier or a structural barrier or something like that. But essentially, you've got either you're separating species from their proximity or you're separating them from their reproducibility. So when we're talking about speciation, remember, we're focusing on two things: proximity and ability to reproduce, right? And so in those pre- and post-zygotic mechanisms of speciation, you're mainly focusing on what we would call sympatric speciation, right? Where essentially, and literally that means same country, where organisms are in the same geographic area and able to mate. They have proximity, but there's something else that's causing a problem with the mating in the majority of the times that we've discussed so far. There's also what we call allopatric speciation, where, that would be the prezygotic barrier where they're just physically geographically isolated, and that's allopatric speciation. So allopatric means other country, literally, and this is where you have geographic isolation. This can happen in a lot of different situations. Sometimes what's really interesting about this is you can have a species that maybe starts here in this geographic region and then spreads. And as it spreads to this geographic region, all the intermediate habitats in between, each individual population along the way adapts to the intermediate habitats all the way along, to the point that you get this population here that's very, very different from this population here, and they are different species over time, right? But there might be intermediate populations along the way that retain characteristics of either the ancestral population or the one where they ended up. And again, what's really hard is, at what point did these two things diverge into two different species? At what point along that geographic way did they diverge, right? And we talked about the fact that biological species definition gives us that point where they can no longer reproduce and produce fertile offspring. But it's pretty complicated, right? And remember, populations are evolving along the way. And so sometimes other country really means they're just really far, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're separated by oceans, for example, or mountain ranges or something like that, although they can be. They can be. It might just be that this population here and this population here, even though there are intermediates in between, they're just so far removed from one another, they're out of one another's geographic range, and they're not going to come into contact with one another. So that's what's meant by other country speciation. So when populations become divided, it can be just simply through normal movement. It can be divided by geographic changes, can be divided by 8-lane highways coming through a particular area. And there are different microclimates on either side that they have to adapt to. But when you have, this is possibly the easiest kind of speciation to understand, right? This is the prezygotic barrier that makes the most sense. If they can't get to one another to mate, right, then they won't be able to mate, right? They're geographically isolated. But again, they're not, we're sticking with our biological species concept. So the key here is the reproductive isolation, okay? If we were to take a species from here, or an individual from this population and an individual from this population, and bring them back together, give them their proximity back, and if they are able to mate and again mate and produce fertile offspring, right, then they're not different species. Okay, it's only the point at which you can no longer bring those two back together so that they can mate and produce fertile offspring. That's the point where they're two different species. Okay. So here's a couple of different ways. Here you've got dispersal. You've got rafting occurring here. You've got some lizards that are on a piece of land that maybe broke off from the continent. They go to an island. The island starts to diverge because its habitat is different and it's got to evolve to match the other, or to adapt into its environment. And then eventually these are so distinctly different from their ancestral population that they become a totally different population or a totally different species. This can happen through other changes too. So any kind of change that occurs, like here you've got a river changing course in the second example, where the river, this population was all one population, and then boom, river cuts between them and they can't get to one another to mate. Okay, those are just some examples of how you can get allopatric speciation. All right, so sympatric speciation, like I said, this is same country speciation. So now you don't have a geographic barrier, right? But a lot of these are the prezygotic mechanisms that we were talking about. And I mentioned in the last video that a lot of times the reason why hybrids are sterile is because of not having the matched number of chromosomes. And that's where this comes in. Okay, where you can get polyploidy, where you can have an extra set of chromosomes, you can have mismatched chromosomes, all sorts of things. Normally plants are the ones that are polyploid, but anyway, you get issues with chromosomes being able to match up. By the way, these are not necessarily terms that you need to worry about. Okay, so no worries there. But essentially, when you've got situations that prevent mating, even though you have proximity, you have sympatric speciation. Okay. So you can also have habitat differentiation. Say you've got a subpopulation that exploits a resource that the rest of the population does not. And then you've also got sexual selection, which can actually change the species as well. Okay, and we're getting to sexual selection here. All right, so here you've got soapberry bugs. You've got some feeding on the fruit of a native species, some feeding on the fruit of a non-native species. The non-native fruits are smaller. And so what you end up with, they're using their beaks to get in. Okay. And so you've got a population that starts to exploit a smaller fruit, right? This is the normal population here. But now you've got a group that's trying to exploit a different set of resources within the same area, the same geographic region. And as a result, you end up with this short-beaked variation, right? Again, excuse me, this is just looking at chromosomes not being able to match, getting to a point where you have a zygote that has an extra set of chromosomes. This is problematic for sorting chromosomes later on and being able to match them with fertilization later on. All right, so the other question is, okay, so what if you get a situation where you get a species here and a species here? They started out, this was our original population, and then this one spread out and ended up someplace else. What happens in the areas, say their populations grow and grow and grow back together? What happens in that space in between the two? And that space where two different populations or species actually touch one another again is called a hybrid zone. So when allopatric species come back into contact with one another, that is a hybrid zone. And there's three things that could happen here. The first is reinforcement. Where the hybrids that you get, where you get mating between the original species and the new species, right? But the hybrids that they create are less fit than the parent species. So that's reinforcement. That's reinforcing the fact that you have two species, right? So you have sterile hybrids. That means they're less fit. They're not reproductively successful. That's reinforcement. And that's what we normally think of happening in a hybrid zone. You can also, though, have weak reproductive barriers, and you can actually get what we call fusion, where the species start to become increasingly alike again, where the hybrids are viable, and you can get the populations reintegrating through that interbreeding again. You can also get a situation of stability, and in stability, you can get the persistence of some hybrids, and they stick around, they're there, and you still have the original two species. Okay, so that can happen as well. All right, so the hybrid tends to have intermediate characteristics, and that's what you're seeing here. Here's the Townsend's warbler and the Herbert warbler. And what you're seeing here is this orange area down here is where the hermit warbler lives, and then the red is the Townsend's warbler. So here's our hybrid zone right here, where the ranges overlap. So you can see that that's what a hybrid would look like. It retains characteristics of both parents. And that's what we mean when we say a hybrid zone. All right. So that's speciation in a nutshell. That just kind of wraps up the rest of speciation. Let's talk about how fast this can happen. Darwin originally believed that speciation happened slowly, steadily, gradually over time. And that's called gradualism. That idea is called gradualism. But what's interesting is that if we look at the changes in fossils in the fossil record, what we see is actually not gradual change. All of a sudden, boom, something brand new exists in the fossil record that we hadn't seen before. And that's called punctuated equilibrium. When you have these periods where selection starts to favor one brand new thing all of a sudden, and it pops up out of nowhere, and then it thrives and survives, and then things kind of that's the punctuation, right, where you get something new popping up, but then that new thing kind of, once it's established, it's kind of it stays in an equilibrium state with no new selection, no new variations popping up. And then all of a sudden, bam, something else happens, and you end up with a new thing popping up in the fossil record all of a sudden again. So essentially that's the equilibrium part, and then the punctuation, right? So that's punctuated equilibrium. So you have these long periods of equilibrium, and then the punctuation is the brand new thing popping into existence. This makes sense if you think about the fact that rarely do things change slowly, steadily, gradually in nature, right? The environment that the species are adapting to tends to kind of change catastrophically a lot of the time, right? You have these big changes that occur all of a sudden. Forest fire, hurricane, flood, right? Clear cutting a forest. And those aren't slow, steady changes. Those are things that happen relatively quickly. And species have to adapt to those relatively quickly. And so this can actually happen really fast. And all it takes is the right mutation in one gene, and boom, you've got a new species, and boom, it's reproductively isolated from the original ancestral species. Just one more thing about that. Just if you were looking at a graph, if you were trying to figure out what these looked like. So if you're looking at time on this axis, right, and you're looking at the rate of change here, right? So gradualism would look like this, right? That straight up graph, right, that we're used to seeing. Let me see if I can change colors here. Apparently I cannot. Sorry. Okay. So punctuated equilibrium would look like this, right? So here's our equilibrium period, and then here's the punctuation that I was talking about. So punctuated equilibrium is more of a stair-step shaped graph, if you ever see anything like that. That's what you're looking at. All right, let's go on now to sexual selection. Okay. Sexual selection is a variation on natural selection, and it explains the existence of traits that really shouldn't exist under natural selection terms. Okay. Um, Darwin was once quoted as saying, "The sight of a peacock makes me sick," right? Um, because that peacock tail is heavy. It's bright and colorful. There's no camouflage going on there. It makes it difficult for the peacock to fly more than a few feet off the ground. And it's a long train of a tail that makes it really easy for predators to catch them, right? So that shouldn't exist, right? Cardinals should not be bright red, and yet they are, right? You can see a cardinal in a tree like that, right? They're easy to spot. So why does that stuff persist in nature when really natural selection should have selected that out of the population initially? And the answer is sexual selection. The answer is that it turns out certain traits are more desirable for attracting mates, right? So our traits they advertise things about us, right? To be a peacock, you have to have access to a lot of resources. You have to have a lot of food, a lot of energy. Um, you have to be very healthy, right, to produce that gorgeous, long, full train of a tail that you have if you're a peacock. Same thing if you're a cardinal, you have to be healthy, you have to be free of parasites, and you have to have a good food supply to maintain that bright red coloration. So it advertises something else about you if you're a male. Um, it basically says to the female, look, I have these fantastic genes, I have this fantastic access to resources, I'm healthy, I will give you babies that would be healthy and have fantastic resources and so on as well. And that's what we call sexual selection. Okay, so these traits persist even though natural selection should have selected against them because essentially the ladies like them. This is what we call the female choice model. Okay, um, where the female chooses a mate based on these particular traits. And that, by the way, is a form of intersexual selection. So between the two sexes. That's sexual selection between the two sexes. Now, female choice isn't always a choice. Sometimes the female chooses a territory and whatever male is in charge of that territory gets mating rights, right? Um, but essentially it's this idea that the female is actually directing natural selection. They're finding a particular trait desirable and they're choosing, it's not random mating, they're choosing this specific mate for a specific reason. Okay. Now there is intrasexual selection, and this is where you get competition that occurs for access to the opposite sex, or for resources that will attract the opposite sex. So, when you see males, it's generally males, although it's not always, fighting in nature over a territory. They're doing that because they get rights over that territory. They have access to all the resources on the territory, all the land, all the water, all the food, but then also any potential mates that can wander onto that territory. So you actually have both of these existing at the same time. So you also see some other extravagances like antlers on males, right? When antlers appear right before the mating season, that's for the intrasexual competition that goes on, where males will compete for a particular territory so that once they've established a territory, they are able to mate with whoever is in that territory. You also have symbolic sorts of competition. There's a process called lekking that can occur where the males all, instead of fighting for specific territories, they fight for symbolic territories. Same sort of thing, and it may not always be a fight. Sometimes it's a courtship display, flashing feathers, doing a little dance, whatever, where you get a group of males that will all gather together and and display for females, but their position in the display, wherever they are within relationship to the female, that's a symbolic territory. So the ones that are the best competitors with one another might be closer to where the female is. This causes sexual selection, both forms of sexual selection causes often dimorphism, and that's where you see a variation between the sexes, where you can really at a glance tell the difference between male and female, right? So here's dimorphism. That's what we're talking about, right? We can at a glance spot the difference between these two beetles, even though they're the same species. Look at what the male has on its head. This elongated horn is there for the purpose of fighting over mates for intrasexual selection. Here's the scarlet tanager, right? There's the female, here's the male. Again, bright coloration, right? And then, of course, lions. We've all seen that, right? That big, full mane compared to the females that don't have the manes, right? Here you see sea lions competing right here for access to a beach, right? This is intrasexual selection where the males are competing for access to a territory.